Good afternoon and welcome to the debut spotlight. My name is Ellen Comisar, and I'm delighted that today we have a doubleheader, a rare doubleheader, with our first guest, Amy Neff, whose book, The Days I Loved You Most, will be out in the US uh, beginning next week. Let me just do a little bit of housekeeping before we get into a discussion with Amy. First of all, welcome again to all of the Blazers who are returning. We welcome you back and thank you for your longtime support. For those of you who are new to the Blaze, welcome, welcome. We are a 30 plus group of professional creatives or creative professionals who volunteer our time to help bring authors to readers and readers to authors. We began in the age of COVID and we have no intention of going away. We are here weekly with lots of different shows, something for everyone. And you can find out all about them if you go to our website, www.amightyblaze.com, and subscribe to our newsletter. You can also find us all over social media. We are on Twitter, we are on Facebook, we are on Instagram. We have aspirations for TikTok, so look for us there eventually. And we just hope you'll join our shows and support us. We do not ask for money. We just ask that you buy books. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go. So today we have Amy Neff, who is out with a book, The Days I Loved You Most, which has already been prepared for publication in 20 countries. Amy is just back from Munich, where she tells me her face is on billboards and she's had her first set of international interviews. And the book has gotten rave reviews. Jodi Picoult says it's deeply moving and complex. Booklist gave it a starred review and said this bittersweet tale, both heartbreaking and heartfelt, will leave even the most stoic readers with tears in their eyes. Blaze fan favorite Pam Jenoff says, grab your tissues and call your book club. And the praise goes on and on. Library Journal says it's a candid romantic saga, and Publishers Weekly calls it a moving story of love and mortality. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We're very excited to have you too. And just to give our readers a little bio, I'll let you sit back and blush. Amy Neff's debut novel, The Days I Loved You Most, is a love letter to the seaside town where her family has spent summers since the early 1990s. The book is being published in the US and Canada by Park Row and in the UK by Bloomsbury. It is also being translated, as I said, into 20 editions and counting. Amy lives in Connecticut with her husband and their two sons and is off to a great start with her first novel, The Days I Love You Most, which has
Thank you so much.
an absolutely great story and an equally beautiful cover. So we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So how's it been? Just back from Munich. Are you still jet lagged?
Oh my gosh, it's been such a whirlwind already, and I know it's just the beginning. So I'm trying to pace myself and really enjoy every bit of this. And we'll talk about my journey to publication, but it's been a really long road, and so it's so fun to be here now, and I'm not taking any of it for granted. I'm really enjoying it.
Great. So tell us a little bit about your love story in the book.
Sure. Yes. So The Days I Loved You Most tells the story of Joseph and Evelyn, and they've been together for their entire lives when she receives a tragic diagnosis and he decides that he can't live without her. So they make a decision to take control of their lives and decide how their story is going to end.
And the biggest impact this has, of course, is on their three adult children who react initially with great shock, but then ultimately it starts to have a lot of impact on their individual lives as well.
That's right. So you see these character arcs of their three children, and the book opens with the opening chapter of them revealing this decision that they want to have one final year together and then go on their own terms together. And each of their children have a very different reaction, I will say, from each other, and those reactions play out throughout the book.
Mhm. And you talk about the book being that this couple, Joseph and Evelyn, have known each other their whole lives. They were neighbors, and Evelyn's brother was Joseph's best friend. And they go off to war together. And I don't think I'm giving anything away to say that their lives are very much affected by another death, the death of Tommy, Evelyn's brother. And for a long time, Evelyn doesn't so much love Joseph anymore. They were teenage, you know, partners. I don't know. They were romantic partners. They were dating, but back in that day, they weren't, I think, doing anything else or much else.
Yeah, it's young love, very sweet young love. Yeah.
But she can't forgive him right away. And so there's this whole sense of these generations both dealing with death and forgiveness throughout the book. Um, did that parallel strike you as you were writing it? Is that something you wanted to pull out?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The book, in a lot of ways, is an exploration of different kinds of love and different kinds of loss. So it is about the central through line is Joseph and Evelyn's love story. But because you have their three children and you have these side plots with Evelyn's brother and other, her aunt is a major player as well in the book, and her mother. So you see all these ways that love and relationships can evolve and all the ways that they change throughout your life as well. So each of the three children, Joseph and Evelyn's children, have very different ideas about love and marriage and relationships. And so that plays out. Their oldest is Jane, and she has a very complicated relationship with love, and a lot of times it's rooted in fear, and fear of loss, and fear of loss of yourself. And so she finds this decision that her parents are making very just unfathomable, right? She
Right.
feels like her whole world doesn't revolve around one other person, and so how can you make such a big decision based on someone else? So that's Jane, and she's angry and she's confused, and she also just doesn't believe that they will go through this, so she's in a lot of denial and disbelief. And then they have their son, Thomas, who is just outright angry. He thinks that they're being cowards, and he thinks that they're being selfish, and he feels like it's a very immature view of love. And then you have Violet, who is their youngest and who's always had her parents' relationship on a pedestal.
Right.
And she is devastated by this decision and this outcome, and she can't imagine them going through with it. But at the same time, she is almost envious of this deep love that her parents have. And she starts to look at her own marriage in a new light. And she's always really been obsessed with that happily ever after without really being able to face the realities of that.
The parents set sort of an example of marriage that none of the children is able to fully understand or embrace because it's just so seemingly smooth and seemingly
Sure.
tight, though they never imagined it being so interwoven in their lives that they would choose to end their lives together. And they're doing the ending of their lives in part because Evelyn is sick. Her illness is progressing faster
Right.
than people had expected, and there really are no good treatments, though Thomas is determined to try to, muscle through and find the right doctors. They're ready.
Yeah.
They know it's not going to be right for them.
Right, and there's a lot of uncertainty even within this decision that they've made, and they present it like a united front in the beginning chapter, and then as you read, you come to find out that none of the characters are really happy with this decision, but it's also they feel that there isn't a different decision that can be made, that would even be another option. So it's throughout the story there's a bit of a will they won't they, and the
Right.
reader sort of can follow along. And I think I will share with you, this is not a spoiler to say that the original ending that I wrote is actually not the ending that is in the book now, so the ending even has changed, so even I wasn't sure along the way how it would go.
So did the characters inform you as they developed?
So I jumping again back to that long journey that I was on, I worked with a few different developmental editors along the way. So I wrote this book over 10 years. I started writing it when I was 22 years old. And um, a lot of the drafts basically were me making different artistic choices at different times and then playing them out throughout. So some of that was the changing of an ending, some of that was revealing different things at different times. So there are earlier drafts of this book where we know Evelyn is sick, but we don't know what she's sick with, and we don't find out to the end. And there's drafts of this book where the reader knows, but the kids don't know. And so there was just a lot of sort of playing with different choices, and ultimately it ended up making it the book so much stronger because I played through all those different scenarios and really came to the outcomes that I was most happy with.
So one of the things that impressed me about this book is that you have different chapters written by different characters, or narrated by different characters, both primarily Joseph and Evelyn, but also each of their children at different points, as well as at different time periods.
Mm.
So you have the story sort of always unfolding in present tense, even when you're jumping back and telling it in the 40s versus the early 2000s. How did you manage all that? Seriously.
Yes, it's a very it was a complicated structure, but I think the reason I was able to tackle it is because I did not know what I was doing when I started, and I was completely naive to how complicated that structure would be. So the book takes place forward from present day when they just tell their children what they're doing till their final through their final year. So that's the present day timeline, and then the past is from when they are teens and they are growing up together along the beach through early to present day, which is in the early 2000s. So spending 60 years. And it was a lot of moving note cards. It was a lot of a lot of research into different historical periods, and a lot of it, I think, is that structure is part of what played into the length of time it took to write this book. It is a complicated project to undertake, and the thing about writing a book like this is when you change one thing, as I did a lot, you have to go, the ripple effects are massive. And so
Sure.
when you change one thing in history for them, or somebody knows something now and they didn't before, now everything's different. So there probably was a shorter way through than I know, but maybe for the next book. Yeah.
So two historical periods that you talk about, primarily, we go back to the 40s and the war and
Mm-hmm.
sort of Joseph and Evelyn and Tommy's childhood and life by the coast,
Mm-hmm.
and also then in the Boston area.
Yeah.
And then the current time, which was set around 2000, 2001. So you actually get into 9/11 ever so
Yep.
slightly.
Yeah.
Were those two, I don't know, timeline choices made early? Did you play around and say, what if they went back to the 30s? What if they came
Mm.
only to the mid 80s?
That's an interesting question. That's one thing I never played with, actually. So it's a
Okay.
good thing, because I think I could have really taken 2 decades to do this. But I really wanted to sandwich them between 9/11 and between World War II. That was an important time period for me. 9/11 is a catalyst for some character growth and changes, and that felt really important. But also, I really wanted to make this book feel timeless, even though it is so rooted in time. I didn't want characters on cell phones. I didn't want characters who are texting and on TikTok and different things. And I love books
Mhm.
that have those things, but I wanted my book to feel that sort of timeless, where the characters are just in the moment. And for me, technology sometimes pulls me out of a story. And so I wanted to set it before that time frame. And so to get them to the age, it's kind of just a math problem. To get them to the age where they would be, I had to start them at that time. So it was sort of playing with the way I wanted it to feel, and then working backwards so that way the timing lined up. And I also wanted the time periods were important, not just as context for the characters and their lives and where we are in space and time, but the things they dealt with on the page were directly related to where they were in time. So when Evelyn and Joseph have their children, it's the 1950s, and Evelyn really struggles with this role of wife and mother. And that is true, very true, to the women of the 1950s who were expected to be home and not pursue any other careers. And Evelyn had this beautiful dream of becoming a concert pianist, and that plays out in the story as something that she struggles with, her inability to do that throughout her life. And I wanted it to feel true to the era that they're in as well. And then different things happen in the 60s and 70s that are related to the Vietnam War. So they're very plugged into the historical periods around them. And so that was helpful not only in developing the characters, but also giving people that sense of rooting them in time and place.
It's very cinematic. You can sort of picture the whole thing. The other character I would say in this book is the location. This is a story about Joseph Evelyn, who grew up by the beach, worked by the beach, and came back and then ultimately raised their family at the same beach. I gather beaches are inspirational for you.
Yes, so the beach is a fictional place, but it's based on a very real place where I spent all of my childhood summers. And my family has been in this same sort of stretch of land since the early 1900s.
Oh, wow.
So my kids are just like Joseph and Evelyn's grandchildren. My kids are the sixth generation of my family on this bit of shoreline. So it's a really special place. My grandma had a very humble cottage next to her sister. And so I grew up with all my second and third cousins kind of running in and out of each other's houses, this revolving door of family and loud dinners and beautiful long beach days. And we just really all grew up in this very idyllic situation. And I just felt very safe and very much like I belonged. But there's also a bit of a double-edged sword with a place where you're so deeply rooted. And that plays out in the book as well, where you have this feeling of belonging, but also this feeling Evelyn often feels trapped by this deep roots that she has. And so playing with that contrast of those two feelings was really fun and really interesting to play out on the page.
You also explored, and you touched on this a little earlier, this idea of Evelyn's ambitions that she pushes down in part because of the time period, and in part because Joseph wants nothing more than to return to the beach and return to that life, and is very content. They have an inn, they have guests who come, they have their kids running around helping out with various things. And he thinks that's the world's best thing and can't imagine a broader life. And she's experienced a little bit of that as a teenager and is completely taken by this idea of what if I did that then? And what would my life be now? Not that she's unhappy, but there's still that tension within the marriage, as there are tensions within their children's relationships.
Yes, and Evelyn always, she loves her life and she makes the choices she makes and she lives with those choices, and she's, I think, satisfied with her life. But there's always that piece of her that wonders, what if? And she lived in Boston. You mentioned in her teen years, she went to an all-girls school up in Boston where her aunt was a teacher. And she gets that sense of freedom and the energy of a city and possibility. And then she goes back and World War II ensues, and, she stays and many things happen there. But it's this feeling of the path not taken. And Joseph has never considered an alternate path. He goes away once to war, and that's enough for him. And he doesn't really want to go away again. And he feels really safe in this place that he knows, where he feels belonging. So that's constantly a push-pull in their relationship. And there really is no compromising, right? You can only live in one place if you're going to be together. And so there's a point where they have some time in Boston, and they're also back in Connecticut, and there's no winning. And that's the tricky thing about that complication in the relationship, is for one person to get what they fully want, the other person can't have it.
Right. And I think that, first of all, is playing out a bit as they're making their life decision at the end. But there's also, that's very realistic. So that timeless quality, I think any reader, whether they have been to the Connecticut shoreline, have a family in all those other things, I think it's something that people will identify very much. You start thinking about, what's in somebody else's marriage? What are they struggling with? Gee, don't they look great and happy?
Mm.
And there was something very, I mean, there's a what's going to happen tension, but there's almost a sense of, oh, I just want to sink into this family. I want to be, I don't necessarily want to be dealing with parents who have made such a decision personally,
Right,
but I want to sort of that embrace of that kind of family. You can sort
I
of just
think
see it and feel
thank
it.
you for saying that. And that is one of the main things I wanted to embody in this book is, things change in all families, dynamics always shift. And this place that inspired the book doesn't exist in the same way that it did as, for my childhood. My grandmother has passed away. Just, things always in families kind of loosen and they break in all sorts of ways. But um, I get to keep it in this book and I get to revisit anytime. And it was really very special to me to be able to give that to other people who either I've heard so many people say, this reminds me of my special place, or I've always wanted a place like that, or I've always wanted to feel that. And so that is something that I feel most honored when people say that they felt that way, because that's what I want readers to do. I want them to come away feeling like they belong.
Right. We have a family lake house, and we're now the fourth generation. I mean, we've only
Mm,
had it for 30 something years, but the fourth generation of has now put their toes in the lake. And we're at that crux
special.
where you say, what's going to happen next? Because I think
Hmm.
none of the next generation really is prepared to continue it, but none of us is really eager to let it go. And it'll be
Right,
a
and the book captures that moment sort of as well, because there are in all families, I feel like there's that breaking point where the matriarch or the patriarch, whoever's holding the family glued together, goes, and suddenly all the things that were easy and the traditions that you held and the special places, aren't as natural anymore. Nobody's putting the effort to make it all happen, and so
work.
part of what's happening with this family is they're coming to the end of an era and they're
Mhm.
sort of figuring out and navigating what that would look like after.
Right. I read somewhere that part of this story was inspired by your own grandparents. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. So it's definitely my family place that inspired the place, and it's these characters are not my grandparents, but I did always have this beautiful example of love growing up. My grandparents were together for over 50 years. They met when my grandma was 15 and my grandpa was 17. He was working in a skating rink and he saw her across the room and said, "I'm going to marry that tomato," old, Italian. And yeah, it was just this really beautiful love story. And it was always very clear that for them, there could never be another. And when they got older and retired, my grandfather would just take these long walks and pick her flowers, and just a really beautiful example of love. And my grandfather passed away really suddenly in his 70s, and cancer. I mean, he was gone months after we found out. It was really unexpected. And my grandmother outlived him for over a decade. And I
Mhm,
just always thought that was so bittersweet because she got to have all these beautiful memories with her great grandchildren she got to meet, and she got to see her grandchildren marry, and all these things he did not get to see. But she didn't get to share those moments with him. And
mhm.
so that I think was on my mind, and this sense that this is something that none of us escape. It doesn't matter how long you have been together, or how much you love
True.
somebody, or how long, how happy you are. None of it matters. That we all ultimately have to face the same end, and we also have to say goodbye to people we love. And so my writing this book is a bit of grappling with those fears within myself of what it would feel like to lose my husband and what the end of life looks like, because I think I've always been sort of as a kid I was called an old soul, right? So it's when they call a kid who's just a little too interested in like these serious topics. But I think I've always been very aware of how fleeting everything is, and because of that I try to be really present, but even that's never enough. So you try to bottle all these moments, and it's impossible, right? Eventually we all have to face the same thing. So my writing this novel is a way to say, what if a character said, I want to choose?
Okay. For those of you who may have been joining us late, welcome. Here is this beautiful cover of Amy Neff's debut, The Day I Loved You Most. Tell me a little bit about this cover. It is really beautiful. It's the beach.
Thank
I
you.
don't know if
Yeah.
everyone can see it. It's the beach,
Yeah.
sand,
Um,
and a couple walking toward the ocean.
So this is actually an original painting, which is really
Oh,
special.
nice.
I think it's pretty rare these days to have an original painting as the artwork. And so Claire Bremner is actually an Australian artist, and um, she was the one who painted it. And I reached out to her, and I was able to buy the painting.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so I have it, and she was so incredible. I guess she did two variants of the same painting, and the painting itself is just the beach scene. It doesn't include the people here. It doesn't include the font, obviously, either. It's just that scene. And so she painted two variants of this painting, and she sent it to me, and she said I couldn't bear to see them parted, so I sent you both. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I have both of them, and we're actually in the process of moving right now. And I haven't had an office. I Right now I'm in the corner of a bedroom, and I've worked at my kitchen table for the majority of this book. But I will have an office in the next house, and so I'm very much looking forward to putting those up somewhere special.
Understandably. It's just beautiful. So you've talked about it being a 10-year journey. Can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about it? And I mean, obviously it's ended with this big celebration internationally, but it started, as you say, with notes at
Yeah.
a kitchen table kind of thing.
Yeah. So I started writing this book when I was 22, and the first 5 years of writing it were sort of very playful. It was not something that I ever really thought about becoming an author. It didn't feel like a viable option. Who actually gets to do that? And I've always been a reader. I've always been a writer. I studied writing early in my teens. I went to this like beautiful art school that I was very lucky to attend, and then I studied English at the college level, and then I taught English as well afterwards for a short bit. So it's always been a through line of my life is writing and reading. But I just did it for myself. I wrote a lot of poetry, a lot of short stories. And then in college, I had a friend who, have you heard of National Novel Writing Month or
Yes.
NaNoWriMo? Yes.
Yes.
So for those who don't know, you take a month and you write an entire book, and you just like a really rough, terrible first draft of a book. And so a friend of mine for college credit was doing this, and she asked me, and I wasn't even in the course, but she said, I'm doing this for my class. Would you want to do it? And of course, I was like, of course I do. And so for nothing, for no college credit at all, I just took on this challenge, and I was absolutely hooked. And that book is not this book. That was just a book that I did, and it's now shelved. But it gave me the confidence, or sort of the permission to write something that is that long, and also this feeling of I want to do this again. So with that in my back pocket, I was visiting that same friend. She was living in New York City, and I had this like very romantic notion that I was going to go to Central Park and spend a day and bring my notebook and write come up with the book. And that was the days I loved you most. And so I actually came up with the title that day in
Oh,
Central Park.
really?
It has always been the title, and I kind of sketched out the premise and the first characters. I spent an entire day. This was 2013, so it was nice. There wasn't a time where I was like, you're there, but you're on your phone, or you're recording what you're doing or documenting. I was just really present in that moment. And then I was in my 20s, so I would write it, and then I met my husband, and we moved back to Connecticut. We were living in Atlanta. We've got a dog and a fixer upper. There was a lot of life happening. We got married, so it was just sort of in the back burner of my life. And then something shifted around 5 years in, where I said, I've been working at this for a long time, and I'm probably two drafts in at this point. And I said, what if we just like really see what this book can do? So the next 5 years were when I went full all in. And I worked with some developmental editors along the way, and I started pitching to literary agents. And I would get rounds of rejections, and I would go back and work on it again and work on it again. And during this time, I had both of my sons. So I have a now 3 and 5-year-old. But
Busy
because,
time.
yeah, so most of this book was written while pregnant or postpartum or with newborns or toddlers. And I was a full time stay-at-home mom. So it was really tucked into the crevices of my right. I get up at 4 in the morning, and I'd write, or while they were napping, or late at night. And so there'd be times where I'd work on it a lot, and times where I would be waiting for answers from agents and just letting all the rejections wash over me. And then I would go back to the page. And so it was also during this time, the timing of it was really tricky, because I started really actively querying literary agents the fall of 2019, and we all know what happened in 2020. And so the bulk of my querying was from 2019 to 2022, and I was getting all of these rejections that said, "We love this book. We love your writing. We think that this is, all the nice things, but we can't sell this right now because it deals with heavy topics of death and illness." And that was a big. It was actually really powerful because I felt validated in the book, but I just knew I had to keep making it better and making it better, and someday somebody would want it despite everything. And so I just took it as just motivation to keep going. And so I just drafted again and again and again, and I was able to really peel back all these layers, character motivations, fears, and dive far deeper than I think I would have if I had been signed earlier. So I think it was actually a really big gift, even though in the moment it didn't feel that way. It was a really big gift to have all that time to spend because there's such pressure, and there's such this rush that writers feel like they have to get to publication. But once you publish, that's the book. And so I think that it's really powerful when you can have time built in where nobody wants it, and you're forced to just continue to sit with it. And so yeah, I actually am really grateful for that entire thing. The book is better for it, and I'm better for it too.
Well, it's interesting that you say that about agents not wanting it because it dealt with illness and death during the pandemic time. Because I actually read at least one review that was talking about how lovely it was to read a book that was coming out now, but was separate from the pandemic. There's so many books coming out that where the pandemic is part of the narrative, whether out in front, like one of Jodi Picoult's books, or just sort of in the background as something that's happening and they're dealing with, or, so what you said earlier about it being a little bit of a timeless story, pre-technology as we know it, that really does make it sort of just sit there and not
I didn't have to deal with these
exist.
modern problems, right?
Right.
Or modern any of the modern things. The characters deal with plenty, so I feel like they have enough on their plate.
So did you enjoy writing the present story or the historical story more? Did one of them grab you in a certain way, or did one of the characters
So
really?
I will say I think there's more of an ease to writing the present day because it's an era that I lived, even though I was I was young. I was in 2011. I was 11, but I lived through that time. So when I was writing little things, I didn't have to wonder, did this exist yet, or what was this? So, for instance, I think of there was a time I was writing a chapter in the 60s, and the characters were eating cupcakes, and I had them just casually peel off a cupcake liner, and I typed that as in just a harmless little detail. And then I said, when were cupcake liners invented? Were cupcake liners out in the 60s? I just generally do not know. And so it's just things like that where you think you're writing and you can just
And were they?
flow. I honestly don't remember if I could find out. I might have just cut the detail.
Having lived through the 60s, I think we had them in the kitchen.
You had them, okay. But like, when did was it the 40s, the 50s? I don't know when and this doesn't have all these things for some reason. So, and then you go on these rabbit holes of like the history of the cupcake, and I'm researching for 30 minutes to write one little detail. So, that's the tricky piece about writing historically, I think. But I loved writing their young love. I really enjoyed that whole section, and that section always seems to speak to people. They love the sections in the 40s. But I struggled when they struggled. I not to write it, but it wasn't as fun when they're not having fun. I'm not having as much fun. And there's a lot of times where when they're going through really tough stuff that I cried writing it. And you hate to do certain things to these characters that you love. And my sweet husband would like come by, and I'm very much a like the version of a method actor for writing. So I have to get myself into a dark place to write some of the dark stuff. And so I listen to sad music and I think about really sad things, and I just like really torture myself to do it. And so my husband walked by. It's like a beautiful sunny day, and I'm just sitting there sobbing at my computer. Like, he hands me a tissue, and he knows what's going on. But that's the way I have to do it, because I just feel like anything else would be cheapened. If I'm not feeling what they're feeling, then how can I write it?
You got to leave some blood on the page, as they say.
Right. And I'm not one of those people who feels like you have to be a tortured person as an artist. I actually am generally a very positive and happy person. And I don't think we have to like write our own pain in order to write well. But I do think you have to understand what your characters are going through. And you can't just like imagine what it might be. For me personally, that I can't work like that.
Well, I know I have a few more questions, but I'm encouraging our viewers to jump into the chats and put some questions in, and we'll get to them in a minute. Um, First of all, I'd love to hear about the experience of going to Germany for
The
the
German
opening event,
launch.
the launch.
Yeah. So a really rare thing happened for me. I got my US book deal last summer, which is really crazy to think it's only been since last year when all this happened. But I got my US book deal. So I basically had 5 years of rejections and 5 years of hundreds of agents saying no. And then I signed with my agent. She and I went through one more revision. And then it sold in 4 days. And it was really like a miracle thing. And so it sold in a preempt to Park Row, which is an imprint of HarperCollins, in like a really big way. It was amazing. Cried. I mean, all the dreams coming true. Unbelievable. And then something even more unbelievable happened. I started getting all of these international deals very rapidly. And one of the deals was with Germany, and it's a deal that is their biggest campaign of the year, and it may even be their biggest campaign ever. And so we went over, my family, my husband and I, my two sons, my mom, and my husband's mom. So the grandmas got to come to be backup as for our boys, and I got to meet my team. And there's like billboards of my book all over the place, and there's it has these beautiful displays in all their major bookstores. And they put me on the hair and makeup, and we did shoots and content, and I mean, just absolute red carpet, unbelievable experience. That I whole time I was like, what is happening? What is my life? It's really something that I will always be grateful that we went and saw, because I think it would just feel like a story that I was telling and nothing that I was actually living it. I feel like made it more
Right.
real. But even now, as I'm telling you, it sounds very made up and not real at all. But it was so incredible. So we got to go. The German launch was first, and then it's going to launch in the US and the UK and Canada, and actually quite a few of the territories and countries are all launching on July 30th. And then basically through spring of 2025, it should be launched worldwide. But majority of the books will be coming out starting Tuesday all over the world, and it's in over 20 countries and languages at this point.
That's great. Has there
Worldwide.
been any interest from Hollywood?
So I do have a film and TV agent, and had some fun creative calls, and those are all these things where it's such a cherry on top, and it's such a fluke if it happens, because Hollywood is so, I think, fickle with these things. So
Yes.
for me, the book is the goal, and the book is like the thing I'm so proud of and excited about. And if anything else happens, then I will be absolutely thrilled. And I think there's a world where that could be, but I also am trying just to enjoy this part as well.
And I think you need to make sure you tuck that Munich memory into your head, because as every author who hosts our show and who I've met says, there's always those events where you show up and you know that the bookseller is rounding up people off the
Oh yeah.
street and the
Hmm.
employees so that they can at least have, half a dozen people in the room while you talk.
Oh,
So,
for sure, for sure. And I feel so lucky, truly, I think, to have had that experience along the way
yes.
of all the rejections, because I understand the flip side of the coin very well. And so I take none of it for granted, and I'm just enjoying every little bit of the success. I will enjoy, and I know that all these things, like everything, it's fleeting. So yeah,
Yes, it
we'll be
is.
here while we have it. Yeah.
All right. Let me get some audience questions. I understand we have some. Jenna Blum, our co-founder. I'm curious about how Amy handled the intensity of researching and writing these characters and their stories.
I appreciate that question, because the research part is such a big element of what went into this book. And what I did was, there was actually three parts of the research. So the historical part, which we touched on a little bit, was also, I wanted to research the specific things that they were pursuing in their life. So I went to a bed and breakfast. They run a bed and breakfast called the Oyster Shell Inn, which is the backdrop for the story.
Great.
And so I shadowed a an innkeeper for a day. I went and asked a bunch of questions and walked around and followed them. It was actually really sweet because I did that in 2017, I think. And I just said, I'm a writer, I'm working on this book. And I actually got to reach out. They no longer own that bed and breakfast, but I found them. We tracked them down and I was able to send them a book, which is really cool. So after all that time, after 5 years, they probably were like, I can't believe this actually turned into anything. So I followed an innkeeper, and then I went to the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and I spent some time there researching and going to the orchestra librarians. And that's a really big part of Evelyn's story, and I wanted to do that justice. So I researched those pieces, but then emotionally, I did a lot of research, and you're talking about the intensity of these characters in the story. I read a lot of books in the death and dying canon. So a lot of books on grief, a lot of books on hospice care and people given a year to live. And I read books. I even read Michael J. Fox's memoir, Lucky Man, because he has Parkinson's, as does Evelyn. And so, yeah, I really tried to not just create caricatures of what I thought being at the end of life would be like, or being in your 70s. And I even had a beta reader or sensitivity reader, somebody in her 70s, read a later draft just to make sure I didn't have any blind spots, because the worst thing I think I could do is write an imagined version of that period in someone's life and have somebody read it and be like, this is not at all. You sound like a young person writing an older person, and not actually an older person in reality.
Right.
And so I really wanted to make sure that I was doing that part justice.
Great. Thank you. Other questions we have? While we wait, I have one question. Here we go. What writing advice would you give to your younger self? The 22-year-old.
I love the advice questions, because I have so much. I've learned so much along the way. I could sit for a long time with my younger self, but I think the big thing is to have patience with yourself and have patience with the process. And I think that's something that I always hear. Everyone's like, you must be writing every single day. You must be published by X age, or it's just like all of this pressure on writers. And certainly if you are writing for your living and you're doing different things and that's how you make your income, then there's more pressure on it. But if you're writing because you want to be an author and it's something you're doing on the side, which most people are, truthfully, I don't think that there's any real benefit in having that ticking clock in your head of saying, I have to be published in a year, or if this isn't published in 6 months, or if I don't get an agent by, it's just all made up. It's all so made up, and it takes as long as it takes. And I also think people aren't fully prepared necessarily for the success when it comes, if you haven't had that time on the front end. And so take the time, and you'll be surprised. You might be grateful for how long it does take, because it's such a learning curve when you get here. It's such a learning curve to speak about your book. It's such a learning curve to take rejection, to handle criticism. So it's all good. It's all part of that process, and nothing is wasted.
Great. I believe we have one more question from the audience. Can you talk about what you're working on now? We've talked about this a little bit.
Yes, I'm working on the launch. There's no writing happening in my life. Yeah, I just really wanted to fully experience this part. This is the payoff for me after all this time. So I'm fully here. I'm fully present, enjoying this, and then we'll see what comes in the fall.
Great. Have you shared this with all your family who has been sharing your seashore time as generationally?
So my parents have both read it. Yeah, my parents have read it, and they're very sweet and very proud. My dad's already read it twice, which is so cute. But yeah, I'm really excited for more of the extended family to read and see what they think.
Sounds great. Well, this has been wonderful. I've been talking to Amy Neff, whose new book, oops, I always do this wrong, The Day I Loved You Most, comes out next Tuesday in the U.S. Thank you all for joining us at A Mighty Blaze. We are always delighted to put new authors out there. I just am delighted in championing new authors. So please follow us online. Go to YouTube. You can see all our previous author lineup and see who's coming if you sign up for our newsletter. I will be back at the top of the hour with Jessica Waite, who has a memoir called The Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards. Also dealing with death, but in a very different way. And in line with your comment about don't set a deadline for yourself, in August on the 15th, I'll be talking to an 82-year-old first-time novelist, Jane Campbell, who has written a beautiful book called Interpretations of Love. Till then, keep reading. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.